you and good evening. And it's always wonderful to see young faces and older faces because as educators, we never stop learning. I don't care how many degrees you have, we're always going to learn something new. So for you young folks that are just still in college and have a ways to go, keep doing this even after you leave college because it's a learning experience, and one of the main things we want to plant is the love of learning, and that's why we're here tonight, to learn something we don't know about. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing our speaker. Dr. Jan English Lewis is a professor of anthropology at San Jose State University and a distinguished fellow of the Institute for the Future. In 2004, she was selected as the outstanding professor at San Jose State University. Dr. English Lewis attended CSU Fresno, so she's a local Valley girl and my alma mater, so thank you. Earned a doctorate degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has written many books about several topics. Tonight, she will focus her presentation on configurations of what makes up a family, fast-forward families and anthropology for the 21st centuries. And a colleague of hers and a professor here at Porterville College will give you additional information. Dr. Simpson.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Simpkins. I'm a professor of anthropology here, and I've been here, this is my second year teaching here. Before that, I taught as an adjunct instructor at San Jose State, where my supervisor for many of those years was Dr. Jan English Lewis. I had a whole story that I was going to tell that I had planned out beforehand, and for the last 5 hours or so, Jan and I have been talking, and I kind of forgot the whole thing. So I'm going to just see if I can work my way back into it. But Jan is somebody I've known for as long as I've been studying and interested in anthropology. And one of the things that I realized in talking with her today was how, when you have a long relationship like that, how people can have influences on you that you don't actually remember were influencing you. So we were discussing the difference between archaeology and cultural anthropology. And if you haven't had any of those classes, I encourage you to enroll in them here at PC. The line between people studying the evidence of the past and people in the present day and their activities, for Jan as well as me, is very blurred, and it has to do with the fact that things are so important. And I incorporate that into the classes that I teach here, but I kind of forgot how that perspective developed. And I realized that Jan has very much the same point of view about these things, and that I learned a lot of these things as I first started learning about anthropology over 2 decades ago. That in all of the time between then, when I first took anthropology classes as an undergraduate at San Jose State, to now teaching those classes here, that this has been sort of a dialogue between Jan and myself and all the other people that I've worked with. But what I thought was relevant for students here was then to realize that in your classroom experiences and your relationships with your teachers, Dr. Carlson was just talking about lifelong learning. I was a student in her classes a very long time ago, but in all that time, we always stayed in touch. When she was newly hired as a tenure-track professor at San Jose State, I was the president of the anthropology club, and she was the club advisor. When I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I moved from California all the way over to Wisconsin. I always kept in touch, and she was somebody who supported me as I was working my way through the graduate school experience, was helping me figure out what I should do, and helping me confirm the decisions that I was making in pursuing anthropology as a career. And when I finished my coursework there and I decided to move back to my hometown, to San Jose, and I started teaching at a local community college, she gave me the opportunity to teach at a university, teaching archaeology classes. And then as I finished my PhD and was looking for a full-time position, and the position opened here at Porterville College, she was one of my references. And so I have 2 people responsible for much of my recent employment history here in the same room. But again, the sharing and the support hasn't ended in all of that time. And so she is still somebody that I can go to with questions or for help or for advice. And so your teachers, remember that the whole reason we're doing this is because we want to help you. And it doesn't end when we turn in our final grades. And we are still here for you when you go to other classes and jobs and things. And if there's something in our classes that was meaningful to you, remember that you can always come back, because we'll remember you. We remember the people who enjoyed our classes and talked to us, and that sharing. There's no reason why it has to stop a year or 2 or 10 years or 20 years. And I don't think I'd be here if I didn't have her support in all that time. I graduated from San Jose State a long time ago. But here we are. And I'm very excited that she was able to come here, not too unfamiliar for her, because she did grow up outside of Fresno. Her mother, who we were talking about today, was a historian who did work researching communities around there, including down here. So this is very familiar territory to her. And so I'm glad that she was able to come down, and I'm thankful that all of you came at the beginning of spring break to listen to her, and I hope that, that there are some things that you'll find interesting and that you'll be thinking about and remember her talk years from now as well. And now I'll turn it over to Jan.
Wow, how can I follow that up? Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone who invited me here. I've heard some of the people that have participated in this program, and I'm humbled that someone would invite me from San Jose to come here and talk about my research and talk about the things that I care about so passionately, and hope I can share some of that passion with you. Because anthropology is a very important part of my life, but so is teaching. And to hear Dr. Simpkins talk this way, I have to start out with saying, your parents are your parents for life. Your siblings are your siblings for life. And when I did fieldwork in China, they would tell me, your teachers are your teachers for life. And that's something that I think is really important and I hold quite dear. So, wow, a little touched. Okay, back to work. So, I came here with a lot of, some of you have talked to me this afternoon, and you know that I'm an anthropologist, which means I study people. Yes. All people, past, present, futures. That's a pretty broad thing to study, all of those people. And it's the fundamental part of what I do with my spare time. My boss, who is a dean, I'm the associate dean, my boss, who is a dean, goes, "You're an anthropologist 24/7, aren't you?" Uh-huh. But I'm also someone who thinks about people, and people often ask me, why are you an anthropologist? I was asked that several times today, and I keep thinking, do I give the honest answer? Which is, people perplex me. People are mysterious. I don't know if it's because I was a nerd growing up in Fresno, or what it was that caused me to think, human beings, why do they do the things that they do? And anthropology was a way for me to kind of get a handle on that, to understand and get meaning out of the question about why do people do the things that they do. Another question I was asked before the talk today was, kind of what makes anthropology a little bit different from other social sciences. And there's a long history, and I've taught graduate level theory, and I'm tempted to go in, oh, we have this theory and that theory. But the reality is, one of the things I really like about anthropology is it's about discovering things that are about people that we didn't know before. I mean, 100 years ago, you could be an anthropologist and go out and discover, quote unquote, discover, although those people knew who they were, but we didn't necessarily know who they were. You could go into their society and learn about them for the very first time. And that spirit of discovery is still there, because guess what? We are creating new cultures all around us all the time. So maybe I don't have to get in a dugout canoe and go up the Sepik River in New Guinea to discover a new culture. Maybe I just have to go online and find a group of people who are really into Henri, the Ennui cat. Is that too nerdy for you? But that, if you are under 30, you might have known about internet memes. If you are over 30, you're going, what is she talking about? Because nerds, I love them. They're creating new culture all the time. So some of what I've done in my career is the pursuit of understanding all people, past and present. Some of it's been very specifically about understanding the world of nerds. And it's always dangerous to study people like yourself because the tendency is to be not so objective about them. But when I went to China, I studied Chinese intellectuals. I've spent the last 20 years studying the peoples of Silicon Valley, which coming from this valley are very exotic to me and often remain very exotic to me. So that sense of discovery is why I'm talking about family today. And the other thing that I want us to think about is that we think we know about families because we live in them, right? You know, you kind of grew up with families around you. You may live in a family now. I discovered when I went to China and did my field work, I would ask people about their family, but I would be coming with my American lens and thinking, oh, family means, say I'm talking to a guy who's 35 and he's married and he has his child. I would think, oh, that's his family. And then he would start to tell me about his family. His grandfather, his uncles, his father, his brothers. And I realized, wow, I just had a little mental bubble burst in my mind because the assumptions that I brought to family weren't true for him. He thought about family in a really different way. And it's that sense of discovery that I think is really fun. So that you can take something that we think we know all about because we live in them, families, and we can begin to look at them in a slightly different way. So I'm hoping in about a half an hour or so, I will have burst a few of our bubbles and we'll have a chance to have some conversation about this. So we think we know about families because we're in them. Particularly American families have some ideas about what family is. Americans have what we call in the biz, cultural constructions. That means we have beliefs about family. We think families are the site of morality. We think families are biological. And we think families are kind of natural. And those are things, if you hear people talking about family or if you think about your own family, of course they're biological. What do you do in families? You make babies. And that's kind of biological. So descent is kind of biological. But we think of that as very natural because things that are biological are natural, right? So we don't question, why is it that these people are in a family and these people aren't? You know, my Chinese moment of realizing, oh, wait a minute, the people that raised me, that's my family. My ancestors, those two are my family. I just haven't thought about it that way. So I want us to think about how does being American put a particular lens on the way we look at families. And it's tricky for us because being American means you're from a lot of different places bringing a lot of different ideas about family from all over the world. So trying to put that together and make it come into focus has been a challenge for us as a culture. And sometimes trying to work with that challenge has given us really strong beliefs about family. But for the next half hour or so, I'd like us to kind of put some of those beliefs aside. Now, some of the things that I'm going to talk about involve, let's see, have you eaten dinner? Did you have caffeine at dinner? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of anthropology. And it's quite possible that you'll go into a food coma. But the way I want it to think about it is anthropology is not that old as a discipline. You know, we're really not that old. Maybe, although some would argue we're older than this, I would say 150 years, really, and that's being generous. But over that 150 years, we brought ideas about family very strongly into the way we ask questions. And so I want us to think about that. Now, I don't want you to memorize the name of any theorist. There's no quiz. You're here, for heaven's sakes, on the Friday before spring break. The last thing in the world I would want to do to you is quiz you on this. But to think about, how have our questions changed? And how does that make us think about family? And in the 19th century, there was very little what we call in anthropology and social science in general, reflective thought about the way people thought about family. In other words, they had ideas, but they didn't step back and go, why do we have those ideas? A lot of what you're doing in 21st century education is stepping back and going, with critical thinking skills, why do I have those ideas and not these ideas? That's a lot of what being an educated person is. But 150 years ago, that was still a challenge. And so I want you to imagine the scenario that you have people, largely from Europe or the United States, going out to the rest of the world and encountering some really, really different cultures and not quite understanding what to make of that. And they made a couple of different things about it. They made up stories. A lot of what I do in my work as an anthropologist, this sounds kind of bad, is fiction. That is to say, I make up stories. Now, I make up stories based on reality, and I call it social science, but it's a larger story. And one of the stories that people told themselves in Victorian times is that we had survivals. Now, let me give you an analogy. Have any of you thought about what the appendix is for? Have you ever wondered, why do we have an appendix? You know, that's the classic story of, well, I don't know what an appendix does. Do you know what an appendix does? We're only beginning to have a clue what the appendix does. So we have a story about that saying, well, it must be there from a time where it did something. We call that a survival. So people would look at other cultures and they'd say, I don't know what that is. Why is it there? It's, oh, it must be a survival. It must be a legacy from the past. Now, sometimes it could be a legacy from the past, but often we didn't know. There were lots of different surprises about families. For example, I'm telling you that the people who went out and did research, they were largely Europeans and Americans from European backgrounds. Now, where do you get your family name? From your mother or your father? In most European traditions, from the father. So if they're going out and they're encountering people who get their family identity from mom, they're perplexed. They're going, what? That was a surprise. And so they make up stories about it. Sometimes the stories would be, well, they are basing their family on mom because they don't know who dad actually is. Because if you were European, that would be maybe what you were doing. If you didn't know the identity of the father, then you would take the identity of the mother. And they couldn't imagine that you would organize a whole society around having the identity of your mother's line. So this perplexed them. And then they would speculate. They come up with things that are very, very different, and then they speculate as to why that happened. And some of that came from, and really informed what we do in anthropology to understand families. We do look at families in their very basic way. Now, these are Twasi Bushmen from the Kalahari Desert, and for the anthropology students, this is from what continent? Oh, thank you. Yes, it's from Africa. It's from the very southern tip of Africa. And these folks are pretty important to anthropologists, first of all, because we've studied them to death. They've been very tolerant hosts of many, many generations of anthropologists. But they also live in a place where human beings have lived very, very long time. These folks are staying in communities that have been in that region for 30,000 years or longer. How many of you have been in Porterville for 30,000 years? No. So this is really a significant piece of prehistory come to life. Or at least that was the way we thought about it in the 19th century. And those folks, the way those folks lived, became our model for understanding how all your ancestors lived. You all folks know that agriculture is a relatively recent invention to an anthropologist. A relatively recent invention, depending on the part of the world, but certainly, 8, 10, 12,000 years. So before that, what did we do? We were hunters and gatherers, we were foragers. Well, how do foragers live? And we would look to these guys and try to understand their family structure in order to understand how foragers lived. And one of the important lessons from that is, if you're the technical term is pedestrian forager, meaning you're a hunter and gatherer who didn't ride a horse and walked around and gathered food. If you are one of these guys, you are not going to want to carry stuff. Because how many of you have ever done backpacking? Yeah, or even hiking with a lot of water? That stuff gets pretty heavy, doesn't it? You don't want to walk very far carrying a lot of stuff. So if you're mobile as a pedestrian walker, your stuff load is fairly light. That's true socially as well as physically. To be mobile, is it easier to move a 25-person family or a 7-person family or a 3-person family? That's a trick question. But many of you may have experienced that. We live in a mobile society. So hunters and gatherers lived in fairly small families. They didn't particularly have large extended families. They may have met from time to time in extended families, but they lived in a nuclear family because it was mobile. So in the 19th century, we would look at things like this and wonder about them. One of the direct, I told you I wasn't going to give you the name of a theorist. This is more of a culture hero than a theorist. Lewis Henry Morgan is considered the grandfather of cultural anthropology, and there's a really great story that comes with him. He was very interested in the Iroquois. He lived in upstate New York, where the Iroquois Indians live, and he was really fascinated about them. Now in the 19th century, this is my weird factoid of the evening, in the 19th century, a lot of how people were organized, and you can see that if you go out to the cemeteries from the 19th century, you'll see that they have like Odd Fellows, some symbols on them, and a lot of other fraternal brotherhoods. Lewis Henry Morgan wanted to develop a fraternal society kind of like the Odd Fellows that was based on Iroquois life. But unlike his friends who were willing just to make stuff up, he wanted to actually know about the Iroquois. So he started working directly with the Iroquois, and in a sense, helped invent anthropology by doing that, by immersing himself with key people who told them about Iroquois life. And one of the pieces of Iroquois life that absolutely intrigued him was that they were matrilineal. That is to say, their family identity went through mom's line. And he was blown away. Why should this be the case? And the more he contacted other kinds of Native Americans, he did this massive survey, often talking to people who didn't know what they were talking about, but nonetheless trying to find out how did family work in many parts of the world. He discovered that in many of them, this was true. The family ran through mom's line, family identity. It isn't to say that dad disappeared or dad wasn't there, but they weren't patrilineal. Their identity didn't go through dad's line. They were matrilineal. And it was a complete mystery. And people made up a whole bunch of really wild stories about the prehistory of humanity to try and explain this, largely having to do with multiple spouses and free love and things that you were speculated about in Victorian times, but you would think that they ought to really come from San Francisco in the 60s. But they tried to imprint upon it some structure. They tried to understand things. So now I'll know whether you're really, really awake or not, because this is the point at which almost every cultural anthropology student fugues out. They look at one of these things and go, what? So we had to figure out, just if you're a musician, it helps. You don't have to read music to play music, But if you want to teach other people music, it helps to read music and be able to write it down. This is our attempt to read and write kinship, to have a sense of what's happening with the family. So if I were to put up a family tree, and some of you may be familiar with this because our modern genealogical charts look a lot like this, don't they? We've used this technique to map out who are your parents, your aunts, uncles, grandparents, generation after generation. Modern genealogy in many ways comes and is integrated with this effort to understand family. In this particular case, they're trying to understand matrilineal families. And a couple of things really strike an American about the way the Iroquois put their families together. For example, and you can't necessarily read this, so I'll read it for you. Cross cousins are different from parallel cousins. A cross cousin is the gender of the parent and the parent and the parent's sibling is different. So my father's sister's children are different from my father's brother's children. My father's brother's children are parallel cousins. My father's sister's children are cross cousins. And among the Iroquois, they lumped parallel cousins and cross cousins. Notice, here's this little thing. So here's ego. That's how we make sense of this. That's our little genealogical shorthand. Here's ego. There's ego's father. There's ego's mother. So you see MO there for mother and FR for father. Little tiny print. I apologize for that. Where else do you see mothers? Can you read that little tiny print? Do you notice that mom over here is also over there? And the dad over here is also over there. So in that kind of a system that isn't a nuclear family, you have multiple mothers and multiple fathers. One of the classic ethnographic films that I love deeply, it's called Trobriand Cricket. I think I watched it a million times and would continue to watch it forever. But there's this great moment in it when someone is getting hit with a cricket bat in the Trobriand Islands and they're matrilineal. And he goes, oh, my mother's. And I just think, oh, a matrilineal moment. And we tried to make sense of why this would be the same in many parts of the world, and we made up all those interesting stories. In the 20th century, we started getting a better handle on it. We started asking in anthropology about families. Well, first of all, most families were studied by, I don't want to be, some ancient feminist up here going, in the 19th century, it was only men studying fathers. But, it kind of was. There really weren't that many women studying families, and when they studied families, generally they were looking at the people who were powerful in families, and those didn't tend to be the women. So one of the questions to ask in the 20th century that was asked is, where are all the women? What is the role of a woman in a family? And how does that role differ across families? What is adaptive about the family structure? In other words, just as I mentioned, if you're a hunter and gatherer, it helps to be small because small is mobile, and hunters and gatherers kind of have to be mobile in order to follow water, animals, plants as they ripen. They have to move around. It helps to be small. Well, what makes matrilineality adaptive? What piece of that makes it sense? And why don't we do it? Why aren't we matrilineal? What changed that didn't happen for people once they got a lot of agriculture, grain-based agriculture? And what happens when families change? We began to see that families are not something eternal and ideal that never changes. They change all the time. And how do we create meaning around families? So these are the questions anthropologists asked when I first started becoming a little anthropologist. And when Dr. Simpkins started his career as an anthropologist, these were the kinds of things we thought about. And we asked, where are the women? And this is one of my little Jan stories. In 1979, this person, my hero, Margaret Mead, there she is. In 1979, she passed away, and I was scheduled to see her on the day she passed away. It's like one of the great heartbreaking moments of, she had this little handful, she was going, oh, I want to meet these young women anthropologists, and I was so excited. But obviously that didn't happen. Nonetheless, her work had a huge impact on the way I thought about how families worked. She was one of the first people to point out kind of some obvious things. One obvious thing, which isn't obvious if you live only in one society, which we don't live in. We live in a very multicultural society, so you may have noticed this as well, is men's roles and women's roles are not universal. You go to another society, their roles are different. And she went to some societies where they were very different, where men had very different roles. And I've gone to several matrilineal societies in which this has been the case, in which men had very different roles. And in many ways, women had roles that Americans would see as much more masculine. Now, what this means to us, remember that question, are families natural, are they biological? If gender roles are fixed and absolute in our biology, if they're hardwired in the way ants are hardwired, why are all the differences? And if all those differences exist, what do they mean to the way we live in our families? So she didn't want us to say, oh, biology doesn't matter, because of course it matters. For example, although it has changed in the 21st century, and it's something we'll talk about in a few minutes, although it's changed a bit, women still have babies. And men don't have the babies. Women nurse, and men don't do the nursing. Now, admittedly, if you're a 21st century American, you're probably going, who cares about nursing? That's what bottles are for. But that is a really, really recent innovation in human history. And by and large, it meant that if you were a mother, you had a baby attached to you every 2 hours. And that's going to limit the kinds of things that you can do. So she would look at those kinds of questions and ask, how does biology matter to people? Well, it matters in some various obvious ways. It does chain us down to certain things. She also lived in a time, my time, because I am a 60-year-old woman, and even in Fresno, we had the women's movement. Even in Fresno. Yes. So we began to question, why do women have the power that they do? Why do men have the power that they do? Not just, oh, this is wrong, let's change it, but why does this happen? And what about it can be changed? And what about it can't be changed? So some very serious social movements, including among anthropologists themselves, asking us to think about these issues. And especially telling us, pay attention to the women and the children. So if you're doing, for example, a history of Porterville, you wouldn't just do a history of all the male mayors that it's ever had, or of all the heads of police that were men that it's ever had. You wouldn't do something like that as your history of Porterville. What would you do? With this sort of thinking, what would you do? That's not a rhetorical question. It's not a quiz, but you would to
women and children.
Women and children. You would look at the lives of a whole bunch of different people. And that meant that family was still very relevant. It's not all about politics and wars. It's about people. And people include women and children. And we need to pay attention to that. Guys, you're still there. You're still part of our families, very much so. So it's not like we said, only look at women and children. Just don't forget us. And we started to answer some of those questions. Why matrilineality? And brilliant cultural geographers figured out that if you overlaid a map of where matrilineality, descent through the mother's line, existed in the world, it almost exactly matched this map. A map of where horticulture exists in the world. Now, horticulture in anthropological terms could loosely be translated into English as gardening. It's not quite hunting and gathering. You're staying in one place, you're growing food, but the food is largely root crops, and it's a very much more complicated system. It's a system with lots and lots of different plants. It's not exactly agriculture. Agriculture, serious full-time agriculture, is often grain-based. I mean, think about, when you think about the history of agriculture in the world, you're thinking about Mexico, what grain? Corn. The Middle East, what grain? The Middle East. Oh, you must eat Persian food. Wheat. East Asia. Rice. So this is a really different kind of growing than just going out and gardening potatoes and taro and a variety of other different kinds of root crops. You can do gardening with some fairly low-level tools. You don't need the kinds of things that you have to push a plow with. You don't have to have, you can have a little bit more mobility because you're not committed to your gardens generation after generation after generation. You can have a garden here and then you move and you have a garden there. But if you're growing seed crops and seriously committed to agriculture, you must control the water. You must control the land. You must control the labor. Those do not lend themselves to women's power. So the golden age of matrilineality is when people practiced a lot of horticulture. And that happened to be many of the people of North America. It happened to be a small band across Africa and a fairly sizable chunk of Asia before serious grain agriculture. And it's not a perfect match, doesn't match one-on-one, but it lets us ask the question about how does the way we live affect our families? How does what we eat affect our families? And so when I was a little anthropologist, about the time, about the age many of you were, I went, if you could imagine this Fresno kid getting on an airplane, first airplane I'd ever been on, flying to South America, which is where Suriname is in South America, going on this jeep down this long road for many, many hours to this really backcountry rainforest village, BITAGRON, or BITA'S garden. BITA was the great-great-grandmother of that village. And all the people in the village are her descendants, and the husbands that married into the women that were her descendants. So it was a matrilineal society. And one of the things I was really interested about, I was actually studying how the impact of modernization affected that village and how it affected their health profiles. That was the main thing I was studying. But I was really fascinated with how families were changing and how one of the reasons they were matrilineal in the first place was that these are the descendants of slaves that revolted. So Maroon societies were societies where slaves had armed insurrections and revolted against the plantation owners and formed their own societies. So the reason you're looking at this and going, wait a minute, doesn't that look like Africa? Didn't she say that was South America? It's because this was an African-based society in South America. Where they came from in Africa was not matrilineal. They were patrilineal. But the Indians that lived there were matrilineal. And they also had a certain volatility to the male population. The men were fighting the Dutch for their freedom and were killed off fairly frequently. The women were the ones that were the protected backbone of society. And they became that backbone. So here's another reason that matrilineality developed. And we have to ask the question, why do families change? After I left Suriname and did other field work, one of the places I went was China. And I lived in China for a couple years, off and on, more than a couple years. But one of the things that's really dramatic in the anthropological study of families is how the picture on your right. Sorry, I have to look at my wedding ring when I go right, left. Okay, so that picture over there became that picture over there. That was the Chinese family at the beginning of the 20th century. That's the Chinese family at the end of the 20th century. What the heck happened? So one of the things that happened was that the Chinese family, this huge family, is designed for massive agriculture. Lots of extended family, lots of hands. Land was corporately owned. It's owned by everybody in the family. Well, every male in the family. In fact, the women, just kind of don't count in that, because after all, they go somewhere else and marry into some other family. And you'd want to have as big an array as you possibly could. And those relationships were critically important to you. Remember my story from China. Your grandfather and my father and my uncles and my cousins. Those are all, my brothers, those are all super important people. If any of you know Chinese kinship, you were actually kind of called 1, 2, 3, 4 for the order of your birth. Yes, that rank is super, super important. Is that the Chinese family now? Not in China. It is still in some parts of the world where the Chinese live as immigrants, as they live as overseas folks. But the reality is they had a lot of people. And they read some anthropology, oddly enough, something that forecasted what happens if you have too many people and this starvation thing. So they developed a policy that you can only have one child. Well, think about what having only one child does to a family developing around aunts and uncles and cousins. Not just that you don't have siblings, but it only takes 2 generations. You don't have any aunts and uncles. You don't have any cousins. Are you going to have a corporate extended family? Will that make any sense to you at all? No, they zip right into the nuclear family. And not only that, a nuclear family in which your only child might be, gasp, a little girl. So many changes. And we began to think about, how do you think about family? There's a really important insight that came from history. I'm not ignoring the culture part, now I'm getting to the history part. That in the Victorian family, something really important happened. It first happened in England, but it happened then in many other parts of the industrial world. We began to separate work and family. Now that sounds kind of odd, but if you think about it, a few hundred years ago, where did you live? You lived at your workplace. If you were a baker, you lived where you worked. If you were a weaver, you lived where you worked. And certainly if you were a farmer, you lived where you worked. The idea that you would leave your home and go to work, that sentence structure couldn't really exist and make a lot of sense. There were very, very few people that did that. So that industrial revolution that took work and pulled it out of the family really changed things. And one of the things that changed is it created something we live with all the time, family time. That's the time when you're not at work, when you're at family. And your class was based on what do you do with your family during family time? Do you go to museums? Do you sit down for Sunday dinner? Do you have a dinner that is prepared for you when you all sit down together? That's family time. So the thing that we now think of as almost sacred is actually not very old as a cultural artifact. And one of the realizations that this particular historian, John Gillis, had is we really have 2 families. We have the families we live with and the families that we live by. The families we live with are I'm seeing my brother tomorrow, so I feel kind of guilty saying this, maybe are dysfunctional. The families we live with are colorful, they don't all live by the rules, people live in wildly different ways, they move in, they move out. Oh, your children don't grow up and move away, they grow up and move away and come back and move away and come back and move away and come back and they bring kids. Those are the families we live with. But we also have the families we live by, which is the ideal family, the family that we would like to have. And if you think about, listen to people talk about families. Are they talking about the families they live with, or are they talking about the families they live by? Because frequently, our culture will give us a narrative, a story that we tell in our heads about how families are supposed to be. And we were really intrigued by this idea, my colleagues and I. So in the 21st century, we began another project of looking at working families in Silicon Valley, which is about as 21st century as you can imagine. And we began to think about how do things like technology, especially communications technologies, you were asked to turn your cell phone off. I don't know if all of you did that or if some of you were still looking at it. I know in the classes I teach at San Jose State, I might as well tell them to stop breathing as to turn their cell phones off. Think about how that's changed our relations. Reproductive technologies. One of the examples I want to tell you about is surrogate parenthood. Remember when I was saying women still have babies? Well, maybe that isn't always true. Maybe some of those things are changing. And a brand new thing, the last couple of anthropology conferences, they've been talking about this, and I'm really excited about it, so I want to share some of that excitement with you. Recreational genetics. I think that is just the coolest thing in the world. Partly because I am old enough to remember when they sequenced the human genome, I thought that that was the most amazing thing that had happened in the world of biology in my lifetime. And now you can fork out $99 and get your own genome. Well, what does that done to the way we think about it? So, starting out with technology. And this is, I'm speaking, anthropology in some ways is the discipline of the obvious. We say something and then it becomes obvious. But it's making conscious things that we do. Well, yes, we have a lot of changing ways, and I want you to maybe think about ways that those technologies have changed us. Is anybody here on Facebook? And some people come on and off from Facebook, and on and off from Tumblr, and on and off from this, and on and off from that. But the show of hands, Facebook. Now, this isn't very different than Silicon Valley, by the way. So the fact that you're in Porterville does not mean that you're living in the 19th century. You're still very much involved in this. Think about what you do on Facebook. How many of you communicate with relatives on Facebook? And to the embarrassment of all the children of all of us who now, my daughter recently said, "Can I unfriend you?" Absolutely not. There's no way you can unfriend me. But we also use it to communicate with our fictive kin, with the people that we treat as if we were family. So how have those technologies changed some of those relationships? As we move away, it may be that I know more about cousins that live across the country because they're posting pictures of their food than I do of the relatives that live right next to me. How has that changed us? It's sharpened some generational competencies, but I don't want to overblow this, partly because I'm old and I don't want to feel left behind. But realistically, if you've grown up with these technologies, okay, you don't have to tell me. If you're under 30 and you've sometimes rolled your eyes at the way parents and grandparents use technology, keep it to yourself, but think about it. If you are over 30 and you have been dismayed how two people in the same room can be on technology communicating to each other and not talking to each other, you can keep that to yourself, but you can think about it. So some of those generational competencies get changed. But what this changes is family is a kind of network. And a network is a group of people that interact. And we have strong ties that we feel very strongly about, that are really, really, I once had a functional definition of a strong tie is someone you will help move. And weak ties, people that you have connections to. Well, all these technologies are a world of weak ties. They're a wonderful world that expands your horizon into all these people you barely know. But those are important people. As social scientists, we know that those weak ties get you new jobs. Those weak ties create relationships that you hadn't expected. If you want something unexpected out of life, look to your weak ties. Your strong ties are trying to kind of hold you close. It's those weak ties. So those technologies have changed the relationship of strong and weak ties. And as I mentioned, my colleagues and I went into Silicon Valley. We did a whole bunch of crazy things, like we shadowed families, 14 families for 2,500 hours, which meant that I would show up on their doorstep before dawn and leave them when they would go to bed. Show up on their vacations, hang out with them on their weekends. Not just the adults. I shadowed kids to their schools. I got to hear what kids thought their parents thought they were doing. And I got to hear what parents thought their kids were doing. And I was sworn to secrecy as an anthropologist not to reveal the truth. But in that process, I got to see that it's a really much more complicated situation with how families are defined, how they pull in fictive kin, how work is brought into household, not just like bringing home a briefcase or something like that, that's pretty obvious, but bringing in the pain that you may be experiencing with a difficult relationship at work, that gets brought home. Kids see that and try and make sense of it. So we got to watch some of those things in the new family of the 21st century. And one of the things we saw is that people are busy, incredibly busy, because the family is where everything comes home to roost. Retirement comes home to roost in the family. Eating comes home to roost in the family. Life decisions, religion, home to roost in the family. And the more complicated our life has become, the more those things are the burden of the family. And I use that term deliberately because in many ways, people are carrying a huge burden of empowerment. Yes, you can decide your own retirement plan, and so can everyone else in your household. And now you've got to figure out what that means. Yes, all of you have got different work schedules, and you're using the car at different times of day, and you have to make all of that coordinate. Figure it out. It's your job to do that within the family. So this incredible busyness is the burden of our families. And I'm getting to a couple of wilder things to kind of end on, but it's a lot of fun. Recreational genetics, that is the idea that you can go out, you too can go out and sequence your genome. This happens to be mine. And so this is my sequence, my ancestry chart. And then it's color-coded for European and Native American Asian, because guess what? Native Americans, Asians, they can't always figure out which genes belong to what, because where did Native Americans come from? Asia. And so a little slice of me that's African American. Now, is that slice of me African American from 2 generations ago or 200? You know, we don't know. So one of the things this does is think of what this does to your family stories. And I have sat down with my cousins to try and figure out genealogy charts. What has this done to what we all said about ourselves within the family? How does this change the stories? Now, some of this has to be taken with a certain amount of skepticism, because the way they're doing it is they're looking at the statistical probability that any given gene is associated with a region. And that is a big set of assumptions. And particularly around Native America, Native Americans do not trust people collecting their DNA for analysis. Too many bad things have happened around Native American ancestry. So, and being able to identify yourself as Native American. So they're not overwhelmed with trust about what will be done with this information. It's a little weak on, for example, 23andMe is a little weak on Ashkenazi population, which is Jews from Eastern Europe. So they did things like they went into the Bay Area and they went into synagogues and said, "We'll test you for free, because we want your genome to add to the collection so that they can make better and better predictions." So people all over the world are doing this. But it raises a lot of questions about how we think about our ancestral identity. And I'll end with a story to kind of really provoke you into thinking about family. Surrogate parenthood, which comes in many different flavors. But you can do surrogate parenthood in many different ways. But I want to give you an example. One of the key places in the world that you have surrogate parenthood, some of the best clinics in the world are in Israel. Israel has state-of-the-art technology. And so the rate of surrogate parenthood is fairly high in Israel. But there's some really interesting questions. If you are a Jew, you are ancestrally a Jew only if your mother is Jewish. So Judaism, Jewish identity, Judaism as a spiritual practice is learned and taught and all that. Jewish identity is matrilineal. Now, imagine this scenario. A woman who is Jewish can't carry a baby, so they take eggs from her and put them into the belly of a Palestinian woman. This is a very common occurrence. Is that baby Jewish?
Yes, it's her egg, so.
Ah, now you come to the crux of it. Some rabbis would say, oh, of course, her eggs are Jewish. Others would say, no, what makes you a mother is the plop. And if it didn't come out of you, she's not the mother. So look at what this does. This calls into question, what makes a mother a mother? Is a mother because she carries the eggs and she has the genes that contribute to that baby? Or is being a mother actually carrying the child and giving birth to that child? So imagine then you've got reverse. A non-Jewish woman donating eggs to a Jewish mother. And this is very likely because there is a global market in eggs. This is like organ donation. Egg donation is a global market, and indeed India is the prime source for many surrogate parents and for many of the eggs. Well, what does this do to the Jewishness of that baby? So they have whole councils of people to try and take this case by case and figure out, is this baby Jewish or not? Or does it have to be converted in order, even though it was born of a Jewish mother, because it comes from a non-Jewish egg? So this is the wonderful world of families. There was a time in my life when to study family was to be a boring anthropologist. You know, to do things that were really, why study family? Everybody knows about family. Stuff like recreational genetics and surrogate parenthood, that's making things pretty darn exciting for us. So I want to end with a last set of questions for you to think about. You guys have been really patient with me, and I promised you a lot of Q&A time, but I lied. This is not unusual. But just to think about what's going to happen in the family during the course of your life. If it's changed this much in the last 150 years, what's going to change in the next 150 years? And how will some of these new technologies change the way we think about it? How will the many, many different interactions we have between families in completely different parts of the world, with their own ideas of what family is, change what the future family will be like? So with that, I will answer any questions, if I have any time for questions.
You do?
Okay, good. That's it.
Now give us time. We have to absorb a little bit of this before we ask a question.
Okay, but it's not really anything, but where'd you say you can get this like genome thing done?
Oh.
That sounds really cool to do.
Yeah, it's called 23andMe. There are actually two places you can do it, 23andMe and Ancestry.com. 23andMe is owned by the wife of the founder of Google. So it recently had a little bit, they used to do medical information, but the FDA said, you don't know enough about the relationship between genes and health to do that. I luckily joined enough so that I have access to my medical information, which is why I did it, so that I would know some of my probabilities. But yeah, 23andMe, just 23andme.com. And you spit in a bottle and you put it in the mail. Welcome to the 21st century.
Jen,
Yeah.
when you were doing the work in the Silicon Valley with all these different families, did you find that they had conflicting ideas of what family was?
Oh, they had conflicting ideas of what family is, even within the family. And that is kind of what made it interesting. I didn't bore you with sampling strategies, but we deliberately tried to do what we call maximum variation, which is to get as many different family kinds as possible. So almost every one of our families came from like a different part of the world so that we could have a sense of that. And certainly there are intergenerational differences in how they understand the family to be. One of the weird things, and I shouldn't say weird because that's very judgmental, one of the exotic novelties of Silicon Valley is that because work is so important there, they've adopted a lot of workplace activities and brought them into the home. So I could go into somebody's house and they would have a mission statement in their house because, you know, they work at places with mission statements and they have a mission statement on the wall like, we are a family that loves to learn. That one struck me very strongly and I still remember it. And so there might be conflicts around that. Some of the conflicts are around, most conflicts are around logistics. We started calling it, you know, the morning battle plan, when families try to figure out who's doing what in the family. Because now with flex time, you know, people are going to work at different times, they're doing different things. Everybody doesn't have a car. Everybody doesn't necessarily want to drive. Certainly your 2-year-old doesn't have a car. Who picks up whom, when, where? Who picks up the food? I mean, the logistics of life. That was where the greatest conflicts were, not over the great principles about, are we a family that wants to adapt to the American life, or do we support this political party, or do we support education, or which religion shall we be? It was, who picks up the kid? Or or kids. And all of those decisions about, you know, which dentist do we use? Not because you like that dentist, but because that dentist office is located near the intersection of a freeway. It makes it easier for one person to pick up rather than another. And so somehow magically all these chores were along where mom goes to work. Now those would be the kinds of conflicts that we would see. Yes?
How do people's ideas about family, how are they affected by the economy or the economics of the country they're living in and the economics of this country as they change up and down?
There's actually a fair amount of research. Our research was paid for by, I feel like a commercial, the ALFRED P. SLOAN Foundation. And they're very interested in that work-family connection. And there's you know, obviously, the answer is much more complex than you would think, because sometimes a challenging economy increases that level of conflict, particularly because one of the things that happened in the last recession is, even though at one end of the economy women were hit the hardest, so women without education were just creamed in the last recession, but women with education actually hung on to their jobs when their husbands didn't. And so this is a violation of the families we live by. And that kind of adjustment has been very, very difficult. And of course, now that the economy is picking up and there may be a few more jobs, at least in the middle class, that's evening out. But there are a lot of potential conflicts that are economy driven. And it really, the answer to that, I guess I'm squeegeeing around, the answer to that sort of depends on what social class you belong to in the first place. But because it hits families at the lowest end horribly hard. The middle class has been squeezed for 40 years and continues to be squeezed with the kinds of things like one person having a job and the other person not having a job, or one person, the woman has a stable job with a company and the man's out there as a consultant or a temporary employee, and that just causes all sorts of stress in families to have that sort of instability. I mean, it's a tough answer, but because the family is where all these hard economic decisions come home to roost about who works, how much should they be trying to get, what do you do with the money? I mean, those are all family decisions. How do you educate your kids? What kind of path should you put them on? I mean, we know statistically that higher education really is a huge advantage in the job market, even if your particular education doesn't map onto a job. It's like, I'm almost never, except in the Chronicle of Higher Education, going to open something and go, oh, wanted anthropologist. But the doors that has opened, just because I am an educated person, it's huge. And that affects family dynamics. That may be more or less of an answer than you wanted.
Well, it's all relevant.
Yeah.
But I was thinking in terms of, well, two things. One, when during the Depression years, my mother's family lived with her grandparents.
Oh, yes.
Because they couldn't make it. And then, you know, as I was raised, we were raised to be very independent. We all went to college,
Oh, yeah.
and we all got good jobs, and, you know, and now a lot of our kids are, you know, just coming out of college and they don't have jobs. And so some of them are coming back, and it's, you know, the acceptability is, well, it's becoming more and more common.
Yeah, and in that sense, I know people doing research on real estate and families, looking at that, and depending on the hotness of the job market or the property market, and you know, I'm from the Valley, so I'm saying this with a certain amount. My brother lives in Coarsegold, if any of you know where Coarsegold is. So, you know, he's going, oh wow, we just had our house appraised and it's over $100,000, and I'm thinking, I'm in Silicon Valley. You can't buy a closet for $100,000. You can't live in a trailer for $100,000. So some of it depends on the nature of the real estate market, but certainly it's really obvious that our fiscal tools, people are thinking about changing the fiscal tools like mortgages to be multiple generations. Because the model where you could buy a house in your lifetime, it's being squeezed out of existence in many urban places in the world. And so is there another, they call them financial tool, is there another financial tool that could allow people to have a house that their kids could have and that their kids can have, but not the model of I buy a house and I leave it to my kids. It's like I buy a house and I pay the first bit and my kids pay the next bit and their kids pay the next bit. And that's a really different way of thinking about it. Now it's not that that has become the norm by any means or even common, but the fact that it's even being discussed to me is a cultural signal that something has shifted in how we think about family and real estate. Yes?
I'm just curious about families, single families, divorce especially. As a teacher, you know, they talk about, I have 5 grandparents, you know, things like
Yes.
this. How much change, what difference does that make? What do you find in that area?
Well, that's where looking at John Gillis has been very illustrative. And he's the historian that looked at the families we live with and the families that we live by, is that actually that isn't as abnormal as we think it is. That the fact that we had a period where that wasn't normal was what was abnormal. That realistically, unless you were middle class or from a very religious background, people just didn't get married. And if you look at Europe now, that's exactly what's happening in Europe now. People are not, even in the middle class, they are not bothering to get married. They live, they have kids, people move in, they move out. Europe has been functioning that way for many centuries. So in some ways, I'm not as alarmed by that because the families we live with are pretty adaptable. You can be pretty adaptable. What the problem is our model, our meaning of the families we live by doesn't make us feel good about that. it makes us feel like we're failures, that we've done something wrong. And that means that there's a disconnect there, and that's never very healthy for a society, to have that kind of cultural dissonance within society. So I think it's a real challenge for us to either be more realistic or change the way we live. But the forces that are causing us to be mobile are not lessening, they're increasing. So it's a problem.
Curious, you mentioned the European families where people have not been forming the nuclear families, not so interested in that. I've heard of similar phenomena going on with the younger generation in Japan.
Yes.
Is that can you kind of compare and contrast those two? Is the Japan thing sort of mirroring what's happened in Europe already, or is it a different driven phenomenon?
That's a really good question. The European phenomena in some ways is just kind of continuing what they did before. There was only an anomalous period in which legal marriage really mattered to people because the middle class.
Can you date that for me?
The mid-20th century.
Okay.
Yeah, the mid-20th century is when a lot of the families we lived by were defined, sort of between World War I and World War II. And I would say this going so far, post-Victorian, World War I was a big shakeup, World War II was sort of the end. And then after that, it started to break down even more. But Japan's situation is very different. Theirs is largely being driven less by cultural factors than it is by demography. And Japan is really, demographers love to create little shapes to indicate. They're worse than anthropological kinship charts to try and look at demography. But the base of Japan, which is the young people, is tiny. And it's like an upside down pyramid. They're supporting an older and older and older population. And there aren't that many kids, and so much pressure is being put on those kids to carry the tradition of Japanese society. And yet there's not very many economic possibilities for them. I mean, the 80s are long gone for Japan, and they have not recovered. There's where the economics and family really connect in an obvious way. And kids basically live at home, and they don't have particular ambitions to have what we call neo-local, or new families of their own. They stay with their families. They're the kind way to put it, maybe slackers. But, they're, and that's sort of a translation of the Japanese word for their own younger generation. And that may be in part because every older generation calls the young generation slackers. But in part it's because they can't grow up. There's no place for them to grow up. And so they aren't acting like grown-ups. They aren't doing the kinds of things that grown-ups do, which is develop their own families and have that kind of adult traditional life. And so really, it's difficult to separate. The Japanese government explains this in far worse terms than